Other questions for Mr. Earp or Dr. Shires? One last question I have for you on a similar theme as Mr. Wagner has suggested. Different type question, though. Conceptually, if the legislature and the governor wanted to spend $1 billion beyond what has been proposed, beyond what's in the governor's budget, $1 billion on infrastructure, and this is just kind of a fun question. I'm not asking for precision here. What is the most productive way to spend the $1 billion in terms of jobs? Not the perfect deferred maintenance formula, but in terms of job creation in our California economy, because you mentioned, Dr. Shires, some of the struggling parts of California, for instance. So I'll throw it out to each of you, this conceptual $1 billion over and above, one-time money. What's the best way to spend it?
You want to go first?
Sure. I can get myself in trouble fast.
And it may not be one, maybe it's a variety of choices.
I mean, I think there's two. There would be one question I would ask before I had to make that decision. The first one would be, what are we doing about water this summer? Okay. And the reason I ask that is because agriculture jobs are at stake if we don't put water in the fields. I mean, it's that simple. Those are direct jobs that will be lost. And so I would think that would be one area if that isn't addressed in some other capacity. I know there's separate conversations on that I would look at. The second area is I would look at selected transportation infrastructure, especially in congested areas where we have economic activity going on, and in targeted areas where we're trying to protect assets. For example, the Northeast San Fernando Valley is one of our strongest manufacturing sectors in the state. Congestion there has huge impacts. The ability to link parts of Pacoima and Panorama City, and where you have the low-wage workforce, and Santa Clarita and areas like that, that I-5 corridor there is one area where you could produce some returns with a fairly, it would take a year or two to get there because I don't think the plans have been approved yet. Mm-hmm. But those are the kinds of opportunities that I would be looking for. Places where the economy is starting to come around, but where the current infrastructure is dragging it down. I think the other issue you have to look at is transportation and warehousing, especially in the context of the ports and preserving that part of our infrastructure, especially as the ports come under pressure from competition further south over the next couple of years.
Thank you, Doctor.
Jim. Well, if I had $1 billion and I was in charge, and that was the only $1 billion, it's not I get another $1 billion the year next and the year after that, then I would probably take about half of it and identify projects in the water sector that are for regional water supply. Smaller projects that they can expand the reservoir here. They can manage their groundwater better this way. They can do some water recycling. You're not going to be able to build desalination plants or anything like that with that kind of money, but you can do a lot of smaller projects that can help a lot of water agencies. And if we'd spent that $500 million, 5 years ago, we'd be in a little bit better shape today. So I commend, the governor and the legislative leadership for doing what they're doing now. But some of that money, we probably could have put in place a little earlier because some of it's bond money. And I don't know what the infrastructure. But infrastructure is the wrong word. I don't know what the process was in place to deliver some of that bond money in those other bonds as well as I do with Proposition 1B. But it seems to me that the system wasn't as well oiled so that we could get that out. The other half I'd put back into the transportation stuff that Dr. Shire was talking about. A lot of projects. The need is so great, it would not be difficult to find $500 million worth of both maintenance and some capital projects that could really target key areas and priorities in the regions.
Thank you very much. One specific action item that I'll be suggesting for this committee today is to ask the administration to help compile a list of so-called shelf-ready projects, and that's a phrase that's tossed around, but along the lines that both of you are talking about. And it'll be helpful to know what truly is shelf-ready and what is maybe a year away from shelf-ready, like the Pacoima-Santa Clarita transportation investment. But I think in various parts of the state, there certainly are water projects and transportation projects that, if not shelf-ready, now are close to shelf-ready. And over the next year or two, we should take a hard look at those. So that's one action I'll be suggesting.
Well,
any other?
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
Yeah,
sir.
just a comment on shelf ready, because it does gets
Yeah.
knocked around a lot. One of the ironies of queuing up construction public works projects is if you don't see the funding in place,
Yeah.
you don't spend the money for the planning, the engineering, and the right-of-way purchase. So they're not as shelf-ready as everybody would like to believe. We really saw that during the federal stimulus. We got tens of millions of dollars out of that. It was money well spent, but a lot of folks were thinking that it was going to be these big projects that you could point to. Well, those big projects weren't ready, but we paved a lot of roads with that money, and I know down south got a lot of it as well. But up here, anybody who drives between here and Reno on I-80 can tell the difference, because that road is a whole lot better than it used to be. So, just a little note about how shelf-ready works.
I appreciate that very much. Thank you both, and we'll bring up our next panel. Thanks again. Thank you both. The second and last panel this afternoon, we have two folks from the Department of Finance, Keely Bosler and Greg Rogers, and two folks from the Legislative Analyst's Office, Helen Kirstein and Brian Brown. And I'll ask the folks, the two from the Department of Finance, to kick it off. Thank you very much for being here. And I want to apologize, Keely, when you gave this presentation on the overall budget back a few weeks ago. I was maybe overly fixated on job creation that particular day, and I didn't mean to ask that question that I asked maybe it came across as a little hostile, and I didn't mean that. What I was driving at was the very topic we've been discussing, which is how to create the most jobs for the infrastructure investment. So, but thank you very much.
And thank you, Mr. Chair, and no offense taken. Thanks very much. Keely Bosler with the Department of Finance. And just want to thank you in advance for taking the time today to go over this infrastructure plan. There was a lot of hard work that went into it, and it's a really important topic that we're here to discuss today. As has already been discussed, the fiscal challenges of the last decade have really meant that there hasn't been as strong a focus as I think that one would hope on our infrastructure. And we're really happy this year with the stronger fiscal footing that we're on to be able to refocus on infrastructure and ensure that we're prepared for the future. So I did prepare a few slides to help us walk through my presentation today. The first two slides are just a little bit about definitions and about how we talk about capital outlay and infrastructure in terms of the state budget and in terms of the infrastructure plan. So the infrastructure plan contains what we refer to as capital outlay projects. And this is not only funding for planning and construction of new buildings and modifications of existing buildings, but also equipment that may make those buildings functional, and also the construction of roads and also acquisition of real property. Generally, capital outlay projects expand the capacity or change the function of state-owned real property. And just, some examples we've talked about: freeway construction, certainly, renovation and construction of new buildings. These are all the types of capital outlay projects that are included in the plan. The other term we talk a lot about is maintenance, and maintenance is funded very differently than capital outlay. Maintenance monies are generally appropriated in state operations portion of the state budget. And obviously maintenance is a key investment that really keeps our state-owned facilities in operable conditions, and is intended to extend the useful life of the facilities that we do have. Examples of maintenance projects are very similar to those things that we do on our own homes. They can be everything from rewiring, re-roofing, painting, but also it includes dredging of rivers or stream beds to restore original flow capacity. So there's a large range of maintenance projects that the state undertakes. And deferred maintenance, which we talk about a lot, is really many successive years of maintenance projects that are left undone that really can cause the deterioration of the assets that we have. So that's what deferred maintenance has been a real problem, and it's really something that has really built up during this fiscal crisis when resources that had been historically dedicated to maintenance were diverted just to make sure core operations of state government were functioning during the fiscal crises. The 5-year infrastructure, which is the infrastructure plan, which hopefully everyone has had a chance to look at, is the first that's been released since 2008. And it's really a compilation in one place of all of the state's capital outlay needs over the next 5 years. The plan is evaluated in the overall context of the funding that's available, and also takes into account other competing priorities for the state's funds, but also balances that with ensuring that there's enough investments in the state's infrastructure to ensure sustainable growth for the state of California. The plan focuses limited infrastructure dollars on the core state responsibilities. And then also, we have a statutory requirement from 2002, AB 857, that really requires us to take a different lens when we look at projects and ensure that they're promoting infill development and protecting environmental and agricultural resources, and also just encouraging efficient development patterns in the state. So that's another overlay that we're looking at when we're putting this plan together. The plan today that we have before you includes $56.7 billion in capital funding. Definitely the lion's share of that money is for transportation. That's the single largest asset, the state's highways and roads, that the state operates and maintains, and so it does it does have the largest number of largest monies dedicated to it. But we also make significant investments in the judicial branch, the natural resources, our web of prisons, education, other general pieces of state government, and then also in health and human services, mainly the state hospitals. For the first time in recent history of the plan, we did focus also on the affordability and debt management. Debt service on infrastructure bonds is expected to increase to $8.6 billion in 2017-18, and it has been one of the fastest growing categories of spending in recent years. And one of the reasons, really is the impact of the budget challenges that the state has faced. We have shifted from a more of a pay-as-you-go practice to really increased reliance on debt financing. I think it's just illustrative to see how many bonds have actually been authorized by the voters just since 2000. We have authorized more than twice the number of bonds that were authorized for the entire period from 1974 to 1999. And that's not only a reflection of a changed reliance on debt financing for infrastructure. We're also paying for additional things with the bonds than we hadn't done in prior years. We had done more of a pay-as-you-go on those investments. Of the 10 most populous states, only New York has more debt as a percentage of personal income than California. Because of our reliance on debt, it means that essentially every one out of every $2 that we spend on infrastructure actually goes to interest costs and not actually funding concrete and steel and all of the other components that we think of when we think about infrastructure. Another issue that we focus on in the plan is deferred maintenance that we've talked about some today. The deferred maintenance issues are great, and they have been exacerbated by the state's fiscal condition over the last several years. And right now, the reported statewide deferred maintenance needs are totaling around $65 billion, with, again, the largest, again, being related to the state's roads. And so we're happy that with some of the one-time resources that the state is very fortunate to be seeing in our state revenues through capital gains. We are dedicated to $815 million to address some of the critical deferred maintenance needs, and I'm not going to list all of them out, but we have proposed to allocate the monies to various of the really most pressing needs and to address many health and safety issues that continue to arise because of all of the backlog deferred maintenance at many of these areas of state government. So I just wanted to end with kind of two slides here and just recognize that we have many challenges ahead in infrastructure. That's why I think this committee meeting is so important. And so we really start a dialogue on how we are going to address the state's infrastructure needs. Generally, the state's infrastructure is very aged, and in some cases is not necessarily suited for today's population and or use. As an example, I'll just say that the state highway system was mainly built between the 1950s and the early 1970s. And each year there are 330 billion miles traveled on those roads. And they're often very congested and in poor condition. So there's definitely a lot of needs out there related to transportation system. I'll also mention that our state mental hospitals, 3 of the 5 were built well before 1920. They've been modified many times since then. But they were also primarily built for a population that was mainly civil commitments. We now have a population in our state mental hospitals that is primarily coming to us through the criminal justice system, and the facilities are not, in all cases, well suited for the changes in that population. Also, just that the state continues to grow population-wise, and the demands on our infrastructure are ever increasing. We talked a little bit about the roads, which is one of the reasons why the governor has really continued his commitment to the high-speed rail project. When you start to think about a state with millions of additional people, you really have to think beyond the existing infrastructure that we have and think about how we're going to address the transportation needs and the commerce needs of our state in a different way. Also, just a recognition that our current plan on deferred maintenance is really a first step. Our backlog is large, $65 billion, $815 million is certainly a first step. We recognize there is a need for additional monies beyond the budget year, but at this juncture and with all the other competing priorities for our state's general fund, we think that's a prudent investment this year. And then also the state has a relatively high debt burden already, so we have to really think carefully about prioritizing funding, and funding is needed for many areas of the state budget. So infrastructure is very important, but we have to weigh the investments here with other competing priorities on the state's budget. And then finally, I just want to highlight a few of the new approaches that the governor has taken to prioritizing infrastructure expenditures. First, the 2013 Budget Act contains a single support appropriation for the University of California, and that's intended to cover both operations and capital outlay. And I think this proposal really was intended, to provide the University of California with the flexibility to make those budget choices between expanding capital outlay and building additional buildings and other support operations of running the University of California. And so that was a big change that was enacted last year. This year, we are proposing a similar type system of prioritization for the CSU system. And also in our budget documents this year, we talk a bit about continuing the dialogue on the role of the state's funding in the K-14 education facilities. The landscape has really changed since the last time we discussed an education bond, and education bond monies are dwindling. But since 2002 and the passage of Proposition 39, which lowered the vote threshold to 55% for school facility bonds, there's been a significant uptick in the number of local bonds that have passed. And since 2002, 652 local bonds have passed and have raised over $71 billion. So locals have really stepped up to the plate and are providing a much needed infusion of monies for capital projects locally. But there are still issues, and we recognize that, and we think that there needs to be significant review of the state's current system of allocating state bond proceeds to K-14 schools. It tends to be a very state-centered and bureaucratic process. And I think we just feel, or the governor feels that those decisions and those controls are better left to the locals to design the facilities that they need. And then finally, our new rainy day fund proposal, in my view, provides additional opportunities for pay-as-you-go infrastructure. As one of the allowable uses under the governor's rainy day fund would be monies above the 6.5% of capital gains revenues that would be going into the reserve fund. One allowable use before they get deposited in the reserve would be to pay for infrastructure projects when we are actually retiring debt. So if we have general obligation bonds that have been approved by the voters, monies before they go into the reserve could be used to fund those projects and thereby avoid having to issue additional debt. So I think that's a real opportunity to do more pay-as-you-go infrastructure investments. And so I'll just end there and take any questions, but obviously construction and maintenance of the state's infrastructure is really a core function of state government and is really essential to fostering the state's long-term economic growth. So it's an issue we want to continue a dialogue with your committee.
Thank you very much. I just have two quick questions, and I'll open it up to the committee. Does the administration plan to produce a new 5-year plan next year? I mean, is that in the plan, so to speak?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. And I think, we did have a little bit of a dusting off period, I would say. And so we are definitely already focused on ways we can improve it, and we want to meet with the LAO and get their thoughts as well, because, it is a document that is very useful in focusing our attention on the state's infrastructure globally. I mean, we often work in silos, and here we can actually see how all the state's infrastructure relates to each other, and sometimes can find new synergies that would otherwise be difficult to find. So
it truly is useful, and that's so we'll look forward to the next version down the road a bit. Second and last question for now is the definition of deferred maintenance. In my years in local government, sometimes deferred maintenance became so large because of deferrals that it was the equivalent in many respects of a capital project. What is your definition or the working definition of deferred maintenance versus the capital project category of spending?
Well, I might defer it to my colleague Greg Rogers, who's much more familiar with all of the nuances. But yes, we definitely do not want it to get to a capital outlays project state, and especially that's very important when we have bonds on projects.
It's understandable how it happens, but just in terms of going forward, it'll be nice to know the working definition.
And I think Greg Rogers, Department of Finance, I think your from local government experience is pretty accurate. Like a deferred project or deferred maintenance, something you can take care of still without having to do further renovations or other projects to a building, let's say. Whereas if you let those pile on and you start accumulating various deferred maintenance kind of issues with the building.
So there's no dollar threshold. It's not like anything under $1 million or something.
No, typically the way we view capital outlay and deferred maintenance, it's not a dollar issue. It's more of an activity-based issue.
Okay. Thank you very much. Committee members, any questions for Department of Finance? All right. Mr. Mullen will hold his question, and now we'll go to the LAO staff, Helen and Brian.